fuel sales suspended, blackouts sweeping the peninsula, and the supply routes that once kept 2.5 million people alive, gone one by one. Road and railway bridges have been destroyed across the peninsula, leaving the Kerch Bridge as the sole major remaining transportation route. That single lifeline is now barely holding, and the question hanging over Crimea right now is whether it can hold at all. Because Ukraine's defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, has said the military is isolating Crimea with drones, and that it looks like, in the nearest time, Crimea will become an island. This is the story of how that happened, and what it means for everyone living on the wrong side of it. To understand what's collapsing, you need to understand what Russia built. The 19-kilometer Crimea Bridge is the only direct link between the transport network of Russia and the Crimean Peninsula, which Moscow annexed from Ukraine in 2014. But beyond the bridge, Russia also spent years building a second insurance policy, a land route through occupied southern Ukraine, stitching together a corridor of roads and railways running through the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. The land route through occupied southern Ukraine became central to Russia's logistics, and Moscow spent years trying to reduce its dependence on the Kerch Bridge after repeated Ukrainian strikes disrupted the crossing. Reuters reported that Moscow allocated roughly $11.8 billion between 2024 and 2026 toward roads, railways, ports, and industrial projects across occupied southern Ukraine, including the so-called Azov Ring highway network linking Crimea to occupied Donbass and southern Russia. With no single point of failure, the Kremlin believed its logistics network was more secure. 2 routes, 2 redundancies. A web of connections designed to survive anything Ukraine could throw at it. But certainties don't last long in the Ukraine war. So what changed? The weapons did, and the scale at which Ukraine deployed them. Ukraine escalated its so-called logistics lockdown by systematically destroying Russian-held bridges, especially those supplying Crimea, leveraging new long-range attack drones like the Firepoint FP-2 and Ruta cruise missiles. These weren't the blunt force tools of earlier strikes. The FP-2, with a 350-pound warhead and first-person view guidance, employs a bit-by-bit strategy to chip away at bridge supports. The faster, artificial intelligence-guided Ruta missile, with its 500-pound warhead, also precisely targets supports. It's a form of surgical demolition, not one catastrophic blow, but a relentless accumulation of smaller wounds that add up to total collapse. The results started showing in early June 2026. Ukraine's 1st Separate Assault Regiment said the bridge near Armyansk was in even worse condition than the Chonhar Bridge following recent strikes. Ukrainian forces hit and damaged the last remaining key bridge heading out of Crimea, the Armyansk Bridge, where a Russian logistical convoy crossing the bridge was severely damaged. Then came the railway. On the night of June 22nd, Ukrainian drones hit the railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal near the village of Rozdolne, leaving it partially destroyed. Russia scrambled. Repair crews moved in fast, because a railway bridge in Crimea isn't just infrastructure, it's an artery. Without it, military cargo stops moving. The next day, members of a local resistance group reported that special railway repair equipment had arrived, and that night, the drones struck again, destroying the repair equipment and collapsing the remains of the bridge. This double-tap approach not only downed the bridge, it also deprived the Russians of essential repair equipment to recover from future strikes. Ukraine wasn't just destroying the bridge, it was destroying the ability to fix it. That's a different kind of warfare entirely. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces described the railway bridge near Rozdolne as the first one to be eliminated in occupied Crimea. The phrasing matters, the first one, not the last. By the time the dust settled on June 24th, the Ukrainian military said it had struck a vital railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal in Russian-occupied Crimea. And the verdict from Kyiv's Special Operations Forces was blunt. The bridge no longer exists. This cut Crimea off from the occupied territories in the Kherson region, weakening control over the entire southern direction. The LANDBRIDGE, the overland route Russia spent billions of dollars and years building as a backup to the Kerch crossing, had effectively been severed. Not by a tank offensive, not by a ground push, by drones that cost a fraction of what they destroyed. Now here's where the story gets darker. because cutting the bridges was only the beginning. The truly alarming dimension of what's happening to Crimea isn't just the broken roads or collapsed railway spans. It's that Ukraine has now opened a second front in this isolation campaign, one that Moscow didn't see coming at the scale it arrived. And if you want to understand just how completely that's changed the picture for the 2.5 million people stuck on the peninsula, subscribe, because what came next in July 2026 is the part where the crisis stops being a military problem and starts becoming a humanitarian one. Ukraine's unmanned systems cut overland routes and then began to target Russian shadow tankers. When the bridges fell, Russia pivoted to sea routes, using tankers to keep Crimea supplied with fuel. It was the obvious backup plan, but Ukraine had anticipated it. Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander, Robert Brovdy, said his forces had struck 19 Russian tankers, a cargo ship, and a ferry between July 6th and 8th, including 9 tankers in a single night on July 7th. In the period July 6th to July 15th, over 136 strikes on ships were observed in the Sea of Azov, predominantly fuel tankers but also dry goods cargo and tugs that came to move some of the disabled vessels. Think about that number. 136 strikes in 10 days. Russia's maritime backup was being hunted faster than it could be replaced. This culminated in a massive decrease in shipping, and shipping in the Sea of Azov dropped by 67% overall, according to some open-source intelligence estimates. On July 11, 2026, Russia temporarily suspended passage through the Don Azov shipping canal, a vital lifeline for Russian shipping, further isolating Crimea not only by land but also by sea. And then the lights went out. Ukraine targeted the Crimean electricity supply, striking the Saki thermal power plant on July 9th, 5 electricity substations on July 10th, and 9 more substations along with the Kuban Crimea electricity transfer point in Russia on July 13th. Dozens of drones hit over 41 substations across Crimea, and many were hit multiple times, resulting in an overload of the grid and power being cut across many settlements, especially in the northern half of Crimea. Curfews and power restrictions were introduced in response. The satellite imagery tells the story without a word. A combination satellite image comparing Crimea by night in January and July 2026 shows an escalating energy crisis as blackouts sweep the Russian-occupied Ukrainian peninsula. What was once a peninsula lit up like any occupied territory had gone dark, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city. A series of Ukrainian drone strikes targeting Crimea's electricity grid caused sweeping blackouts through much of the peninsula, and local Kremlin-installed authorities set up emergency assistance centers. Crimea's electricity supplier, Kremenergo, announced on July 7th that due to accidents caused by enemy drone strikes, a number of populated areas were currently without power supply. This is what a siege looks like in the 21st century. Not troops surrounding a city, drones dismantling every system that keeps it functional. One substation, one tanker, one bridge at a time. The fuel crisis is where the civilian reality gets sharpest. 4 people were killed, and fuel sales were suspended in Russian-occupied Crimea on June 21, 2026, after a massive Ukrainian barrage hit the Black Sea Peninsula. But the suspension didn't end when the barrage stopped. Russian-appointed Crimean Governor Sergei Aksyonov warned that fuel shortages on the occupied peninsula would remain tense, with public sales unavailable on some days. The word tense is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Queues formed at gas stations in Sevastopol and Yevpatoria, and the occupation authorities of Crimea even temporarily stopped selling gasoline to civilians altogether, leaving fuel only for state structures, ensuring the region's security. At the end of May, the occupation administration limited gasoline sales to 20 liters per car owner per week, using prepaid coupons. By July, even that ration had collapsed for most people. After Crimea's occupation head, Sergei Aksyonov claimed steps were being taken to address the situation. Hundreds of locals flooded the comments of his Telegram post, challenging his narrative, with people reporting that no fuel was available and that the only access to fuel was through the black market. Local reporting from inside Crimea describes a local economy struggling because of unreliable electricity, water shortages, and problems with deliveries. Even when the power comes back for a short time, many shops and services stay closed since they can't count on refrigeration, payment systems, or steady internet. leaving people and small businesses facing daily uncertainty. A state of emergency was declared in Crimea, with authorities banning all fuel sales. The Moscow Times reported that the fuel shortage also resulted in a disruption of Crimea's tourism industry. That detail cuts through the military analysis in a particular way. Tourism. The families who came to the beach resorts of the Black Sea, the hotels in Yalta, the summer crowds that once made Crimea feel like a normal, functioning place, all of that has evaporated. Now, what is Russia doing to fight back? That's a fair question, and it deserves a straight answer. Moscow still holds cards. The Kerch bridge, though degraded and running at reduced capacity, has not been destroyed. As of 2026, the bridge remains operational at reduced capacity, with speed restrictions. That single crossing is still moving some volume of goods and personnel. Russia has also accelerated its own drone interceptor programs and worked to harden certain logistics corridors in the region. And the peninsula is not starving. Food supply chains, though disrupted, haven't completely collapsed. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky said there had been 7,028 successful mid-range strikes in 2026, with almost double the May total, 3,800, landing in June alone. Russia's ability to absorb that pace of attrition is the core question. Its engineering units are skilled and disciplined. Its repair capacity, while damaged by the double-tap tactic Ukraine has deployed, isn't zero. But here's the single truth that doesn't change. Ukrainian strikes are targeting Russia's energy infrastructure and supply routes, exposing Crimea's dependence on vulnerable logistics and turning the militarized peninsula into a growing liability for Moscow. Every ruble spent keeping the peninsula supplied is a ruble not spent elsewhere. Every repair team rushed to Crimea is a team not fixing a frontline bridge in Zaporizhia. The military cost of holding Crimea is rising, and it's rising fast. The strikes against Crimea and the Sea of Azov are part of a campaign of mid-range strikes begun in 2026 to starve Russia's front line of fuel and weapons, and the Kremlin of export revenue from fossil fuels. Ukraine named the July operation Molochka. Ukraine's operation named Molochka began on July 6th. That name won't mean much to most viewers, but the effects are everywhere. In dark streets, in dry fuel pumps, in the Sea of Azov, where tanker traffic has collapsed to a third of what it was. Analysis of Ukrainian General Staff daily reports shows that Ukraine destroyed nearly 72,000 vehicles and fuel tanks between 2022 and 2025, and the projection for 2026 alone is a staggering 74,500, more than the grand total for the first 4 years of the full-scale war. This isn't a campaign that's winding down, it's accelerating. On July 4, 2026, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine estimated that 42% of Russia's oil refining capacity had been disabled at that time, nearly half. And Crimea sits at the end of that supply chain, the last stop before a very long dead end. Novaya Gazeta Europe estimated that the fuel crisis had spread to at least 78 of the 83 internationally recognized regions of the Russian Federation, plus occupied Crimea and Sevastopol. The peninsula isn't an isolated case. It's the most extreme example of a systemic collapse that's widening across the entire Russian state. What does this mean for the people living there? The fuel shortage disrupted Crimea's tourism industry, the one economic activity that still made civilian life feel connected to something normal. The military presence on the peninsula was always enormous. Now it's inescapable because the civilian economy has collapsed around it. Ukraine has also launched attacks on oil refineries in Crimea, suspending fuel sales on the peninsula. A refinery, a canal bridge, a substation, a tanker fleet. Strip them away layer by layer, and what's left isn't a region, it's a garrison. 2.5 million people are learning what it means to live inside that garrison. Not as abstract statistics, but as residents standing in kilometer-long queues for fuel that doesn't arrive. Waking up to darkness that no schedule explains. Watching small businesses close because the power grid can't be trusted for even a refrigerator to run. Ukraine Commander Robert Magyar said it plainly back in June, when the bridge campaign was just beginning. The goal is to isolate Crimea in the near future. What wasn't clear then was how comprehensively that campaign would develop, from road bridges to railway spans, from overland routes to sea lanes, from fuel tankers to power substations, from military logistics to civilian daily life. Since June 2026, Ukraine has ramped up its strikes on strategic targets in Crimea on a timeline and at a scale that has left Russian occupation authorities visibly struggling to keep pace. The Kerch bridge remains, but it's now carrying the entire weight of a peninsula that once had 6 different supply corridors. That bridge is one strike away from becoming the last thread, and everyone on both sides knows it. The land bridge is gone. The sea lanes are bleeding. The lights are out. What Russia called its unsinkable aircraft carrier is taking on water. Does the fall of Crimea's supply network mean Russia loses the peninsula outright? Or can Moscow hold it through the Kerch bridge alone, long enough to turn the tide? And if Crimea does become functionally isolated, what happens to the 2.5 million people caught inside that blockade? What do you think? Tell me in the comments.